A man sits at a table where the argument has already started and he says nothing. His jaw holds a slight tension, but his voice stays level, almost rehearsed in its calm. Nobody asks whether his silence costs him anything, because silence has never looked like cost. It looks like control, like patience, like the discipline of someone who simply chooses not to react. He nods at the right moments, absorbs the sharper words, and lets the room settle around him. This is not a single evening. This pattern has repeated itself for decades without anyone naming it. The silence is not empty, it is full of calculations nobody else can see happening. He is measuring the cost of speaking against the cost of staying still, and stillness wins again. Somewhere behind the calm face, a sentence forms and dissolves before it ever reaches his mouth. He has done this so many times that the dissolving now happens faster than the forming. You have watched this exact face before, maybe across a dinner table, maybe across a desk. You called it patience or maturity or simply the way certain men are built. Nobody in the room asks what silence like that is actually protecting or from whom. The question sits there, unspoken, doing exactly what the man himself is doing. That same stillness follows him into rooms that have nothing to do with conflict at all. He absorbs a colleague's blame for a mistake that was never his in the first place. He lets a friend's careless comment pass without correction, choosing the smaller wound over the larger scene. He apologizes first in arguments he did not start, simply to end them faster than they began. Each of these moments looks isolated, a small kindness, a minor concession, nothing worth examining closely. Strung together across 30 years, they form something closer to a governing law than a habit. He has learned that peace is measured by what does not happen rather than by what does. A room stays calm because he has already removed himself from it emotionally, long before he physically leaves. You recognize this shape because you have lived beside a version of it, maybe without ever naming what you saw. The recognition itself is quiet, the way most recognitions of familiar people tend to be. What makes this pattern so persistent that it survived every decade since his childhood? He was not born choosing silence. Something around him made silence the only available answer. He grew up in households where two incomes were rarely optional and rarely enough regardless. Parents worked long hours and children learned early how to occupy themselves without asking for help. A house key on a string around the neck became an ordinary, unremarkable object of daily life. Nobody discussed what it meant for a child to manage hours alone before language for feelings existed.
At the same time, the culture around him equated composure with strength and complaint with weakness. Men who came before him modeled restraint as the only acceptable emotional posture available to a man. Technology arrived mid-career rather than in childhood, forcing an adaptation without patience for confusion or complaint. Job security, once assumed, became conditional, then unstable, then something entirely renegotiated with every recession. He became responsible for aging parents while still supporting children of his own simultaneously. Every one of these conditions demanded the same currency: composure, reliability, the absence of visible strain. No single force explains the silence completely. Several forces converged and reinforced each other continuously. What results is not one adaptation, but several, layered so tightly they now look like a single trait. What looks like one habit is actually operating on several depths at once, each quieter than the last. 7 layers move beneath the surface, each one explaining what the layer above could not. Observable behavior sits closest to view, the part anyone could notice within a single conversation. Beneath it, habitual patterns repeat the behavior until it no longer requires conscious choice. Beneath that, identity absorbs the pattern until the behavior becomes part of who he believes himself to be. Beneath identity, responsibility recasts the pattern as duty rather than as preference or personality. Beneath responsibility, relationships quietly reorganize themselves around the presence of that duty. Beneath relationships, meaning itself shifts, redefining peace as an achievement rather than a shared condition. Beneath meaning, a collective blind spot holds an entire generation inside the same unexamined assumption. Each layer answers a question the one above it left open, and each raises a sharper one. The first layer begins exactly where the observation started, at the moment he chose to say nothing. He goes quiet the instant a conversation begins to tilt toward confrontation, almost before the tilt is visible. His hands still, his shoulders square slightly, and his sentences shorten until they nearly disappear. He deflects with a joke when the tension rises past a threshold only he seems to sense. He changes the subject smoothly enough that most people never notice a subject was changed at all. You have seen a man do this at a family gathering, steering a room away from its own friction. The steering looked skillful, even generous, like someone protecting the evening for everyone else's sake. Few people ask what it costs him to constantly monitor a room for temperature and adjust it alone. That question becomes unavoidable once the same behavior repeats across every setting, every relationship, every year. Why does a behavior like this repeat so consistently across so many unrelated situations? It repeats because avoiding conflict once produced a reliable, immediate sense of relief, and relief reinforces behavior. Every time tension drops after his silence, his nervous system logs the exchange as a successful strategy. The brain does not distinguish between a strategy that heals a relationship and one that merely postpones its cost. Repetition without correction turns a coping response into something closer to a reflex than a decision. He no longer weighs whether to stay quiet. The choice has already been made before he notices it forming. This is what people mean when they say someone is naturally calm, without realizing calm was built, not given.
A mechanism repeated enough times stops resembling a mechanism and starts resembling a personality. Once a response becomes automatic, it no longer needs the situation that originally created it to activate. A response that no longer needs its original trigger will eventually apply itself everywhere, indiscriminately. He stays quiet in arguments that matter and in arguments that do not, unable to tell the difference anymore. Small disagreements receive the same suppression once reserved for genuine emotional threats decades earlier. Over the years, the boundary between necessary restraint and unnecessary self-erasure quietly disappears. He no longer experiences this as choosing peace. He experiences it as simply being who he is. The people around him stop expecting him to react, and their expectations become part of the pressure keeping him silent. A reaction from him now would surprise people more than the situation that provoked it. This is what accumulation looks like from the inside, not a decision repeated, but a decision forgotten. Something disappears when a response repeats long enough to erase its own origin story. What disappeared exactly somewhere between the first quiet moment and the 1000th? His capacity to identify what he actually feels in the instant a conflict begins. Not the capacity to feel, which remains intact, but the capacity to locate the feeling quickly enough to name it. Naming requires practice, and practice requires permission, and permission was never something he was given. So the feeling still arrives, but it arrives formless, without language fast enough to catch it before it passes. What people see instead is composure, but composure built this way is not calm, it is absence. The absence rarely announces itself because absence, by definition, produces nothing visible to notice. Only later, in quieter moments alone, does the shape of what is missing become briefly perceptible. A cost hidden this well does not disappear, it simply relocates somewhere less visible than behavior. Where does a cost go once it can no longer be located in visible behavior? It relocates into relationships, appearing not as conflict but as a specific, persistent kind of distance. A partner describes him as present but somehow unreachable, physically close and emotionally unavailable in the same moment. Children learn early that certain subjects will not be met with much beyond a nod and a change in tone. Friends describe him as easy to be around and also strangely difficult to actually know. Nobody in these relationships is doing anything wrong. The distance was built gradually without any single decisive moment. It formed the same way erosion forms a canyon, through repetition too slow to notice happening in real time. The people closest to him mistake his silence for calm, the same mistake he made about himself. A relationship organized around someone's silence eventually forgets it was ever organized around anything else. Once a relationship forgets its own structure, the participants stop questioning what that structure actually protects. Peace in this arrangement gets redefined as an absence of visible disruption rather than a presence of real connection. He believes he is protecting the people around him by keeping his internal weather to himself. What he is actually doing is withholding the information they would need to reach him fully. The room stays calm, but calm rooms are not the same thing as connected rooms, though they can look identical.
He has spent decades optimizing for a kind of peace that resembles safety without providing much of it. This redefinition did not happen consciously. It accumulated the same way the silence itself accumulated, unnoticed. A definition of peace this narrow eventually becomes indistinguishable from a definition of isolation. An entire generation of men arrived at roughly the same definition without ever comparing notes. They were taught, separately but almost identically, that composure signals strength and emotional expression signals its opposite. This teaching was rarely stated directly. It arrived through example, through silence modeled by fathers who learned it from their own fathers. What makes this a blind spot rather than simply a shared trait is the invisibility of the pattern to the men living inside it. Each man believes his own silence is a personal choice, unaware it is also a generational inheritance. Because the pattern is collective, no individual feels responsible for questioning it, and no individual feels equipped to. A blind spot this widespread does not look like a problem, it looks like the normal shape of manhood itself. Recognizing a pattern this deep does not require blame, it only requires noticing that it exists at all. Once noticed, the pattern cannot be unnoticed, even if nothing about the behavior changes immediately afterward. There is no deeper layer left to uncover once the collective blind spot has been named directly. What remains is not a summary of the 7 layers, but a recognition of how tightly they were bound together. The observable quiet was never separate from the identity built to justify it, nor from the relationships shaped around both. Each layer fed the others continuously, so that changing one without addressing the rest would leave the structure standing. The behavior needed the mechanism to persist. The mechanism needed the accumulation to feel permanent. The accumulation needed the hidden cost to remain hidden. The hidden cost needed distance in relationships to stay unnoticed, and distance needed a narrow definition of peace to feel acceptable. That definition needed an entire generation to share it, so that no single man would ever feel like an exception. None of these layers explain the man completely, but together they explain why the silence never broke on its own. A single observation remains after the layers stop revealing anything further to uncover. The man in the room, the one who says nothing while the argument continues around him, is still just a shape. He is not a story, not a memory, not an experience anyone needs to have lived to recognize. What once looked like a personal trait now looks like the visible edge of something far larger and far older. The recognition does not resolve into an answer, it simply confirms that the pattern was real all along. This inquiry stops exactly here, at the moment the pattern becomes impossible to unsee. Something else remains unexplained, sitting just beyond the edge of everything examined so far. What happens to a silence like this when it finally reaches its limit and stops holding? The man has not been asked that question yet, and neither has the pattern that built him. He remains, for now, a shape still forming, still absorbing, still choosing stillness over disruption. You are invited to keep watching, not to find a resolution, but to continue noticing what the pattern does next. Thank you for staying through this entire inquiry into a pattern many people recognize but rarely name. If one of these 7 layers felt closer to something familiar than the others, that recognition is worth sitting with. Subscribing and turning on notifications simply keeps this same quiet, observational inquiry available whenever the next pattern surfaces.